Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My name is Teresa Wright and I am the chair of the Political Science Department at Cal State Long Beach. And I'm here today with three of my colleagues in the Political Science Department, Doctors Jason Whitehead, Charles Mahoney, and Kevin Wallsten. Jason Whitehead received his PhD in political science from the University of Southern California. He's an expert in the law and courts, judicial politics, judicial decision-making, constitutional law, legal theory, and religion and law. Second on the end, we have Charles Mahoney. Charles has a PhD in political science from UCLA, and he is a specialist in the areas of international security, terrorism, insurgency, private military, and security corporations. And then finally, to my right, Kevin Wallsten earned his PhD in political science from UC Berkeley. He publishes widely in the fields of American political behavior, the mass media, and the internet. We're here today to talk about the major domestic and foreign policy issues that are facing the American public in the context of our upcoming elections. And we're going to begin with a discussion of some of the most pressing domestic issues, and I'm going to start with you, Jason, with a question. Since the last election, we don't seem to have heard much about same-sex marriage. Is this a settled issue? Is there more up for debate on this?
Yeah, I mean, given the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in June making same-sex marriage a constitutional right and forbidding any state from refusing to recognize it, it does seem to have settled as far as that particular issue. However, the issues surrounding same-sex marriage have really heated up, especially with regard to religious exemptions. So, for example, there are a number of cases working their way through the federal and state court systems dealing with individuals who have a religious objection to same-sex marriage, who have been fined, penalized, otherwise punished for refusing to participate somehow in same-sex marriages. So think, for example, of there's a florist in the state of Washington who, when asked to provide service flowers for a same-sex wedding, refused and was fined by the Human Rights Commission of the state of Washington and is now appealing that, has now, I think, appealed and now is suing them in state court, and that will work its way up. And that's just one example of literally, scores of cases that are like that are working their way through. There are also some objectors at the government level. Judge Roy Moore down in Alabama has been making some news recently by ordering all of the probate judges in Alabama to not issue those marriage licenses to same-sex couples. The recent news indicates that most of the probate judges are ignoring him, so that probably is not going to get much traction. I think the main thing that's really going to affect that could at least affect the election is there's new legislation that's working its way through states, and Republicans have been making news a little bit of news in Congress about trying to create carve out some exemptions for religious individuals who don't want to participate, to protect their religious freedom. So really what it's done is it's shifted the fight from a constitutional fight over the rights of same-sex couples to a constitutional fight over the rights of religious individuals who object to same-sex activity. So that's really the way that it's shifting. Who knows how that will affect the election? It doesn't seem like the candidates are talking much about religious objections. If something happens legally that makes that more of a bombshell, perhaps it could affect the outcome.
So we may end up hearing more about it. What about something that we seem to be hearing much more about are challenges to Obamacare? Can you tell us a little bit about what is being debated here?
Yes, so there have been two major legal challenges to Obamacare that have been turned back by the U.S. Supreme Court. They eventually were rejected. And interestingly, both of them, the key vote was provided by Chief Justice Roberts, a Republican appointee to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's an interesting sort of political, an unpredictable political move by the Supreme Court to uphold Obamacare twice. But there's a new challenge. There are a number of new challenges. There are 7 cases pending before the U.S. Supreme Court that have now been consolidated that have to do with, again, the issue of religious objections. In this case, the Department of Health and Human Services created a rule that required all employers under Obamacare to provide health care, obviously to provide health care, but to provide contraceptive services, a number of different contraceptive devices and medication and other things that are provided, that are authorized by the FDA. They should be allowed under Obamacare. However, many religious, again, individuals, companies, businesses are objecting to having to provide those services. So Little Sisters of the Poor. This makes it interesting because you've got this group of nuns who do a lot of great charitable work in the community. Pope Francis actually visited them during his visit to the U.S., and it made big news. So they are sort of the lead plaintiffs in this new case, challenging that Obamacare provision on contraception, saying that religious nonprofits and also religious organizations that are not churches, like Little Sisters of the Poor, should be exempt from that element of Obamacare. So that's something the Supreme Court has taken. It's going to hear arguments on this term. If that gets decided, it'll probably be, usually those kinds of cases get decided toward the end of the term in June, just as the summer campaigns are beginning to heat up for the general election, or for the heading into the conventions and then the general election. It's possible that could get some traction, and people could be, there'll be passions on both sides of that issue.
And both seem to kind of relate to religious objections.
Right, exactly. It's sort of where the fight has now shifted on both of those issues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So shifting to something that sort of bridges foreign policy and domestic policy, immigration has also received a lot of attention lately. Can you tell us a little bit about the current legal situation here, Obama's role, objections to this?
Yeah, that's probably more of an issue that's it's a hot topic right now that's really being debated by not only by the public but by the candidates. A couple of things. President Obama has been using executive orders to deal with immigration issues, largely because of the gridlock. We have to see all these issues, I think, in the context of this massive split in the country. Is a great divide in the country that is reflected certainly in Congress. And so since it's very difficult with that partisan divide to get any legislation passed on immigration, President Obama has been issuing executive orders. For example, the deferred action for children of immigrants, childhood arrivals. It's called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That was several years ago in 2012, which exempted anyone under the age of 16 who had been brought here by a parent illegally. It actually exempts them from deportation, gives them legal work status, and also gives them a path to citizenship. So it does some of the things that certain legislation would have done, like the DREAM Act and other things that have been debated in Congress that simply can't get passed because of the gridlock in Congress. President Obama's just been going around Congress by issuing executive orders like that. The most recent one, however, is a 2014 executive order dealing not with the children of illegal immigrants, but with parents of American citizens who made themselves, the parents may be illegal immigrants. So he's doing the same thing now with those parents, exempting them from deportation and providing not a path to citizenship for them, but certainly legal work status. And that's created a huge furor. 26 states now have sued the federal government over that. mostly the states that are affected by illegal immigration. And the U.S. Supreme Court has now taken the challenge, and they're going to decide again this term, probably toward the end of the term, whether Obama has acted unconstitutionally. I think the key thing there is not so much the technical legal issue of how it arrives at that conclusion. I think it's mainly that if the court decides that Obama has acted illegally, it gives Republicans ammunition, because this has been their narrative for a long time, that Obama is not acting in a democratic way, that he's actually acting, some of them have gotten really kind of over the top, saying that Obama's been acting more like a king than a president. There's been a lot of things that have been lighting up Republican blogs like that. So this will give them added ammunition if the court does overturn that executive order. And he's been issuing executive orders on gun control and a number of other things that could call those into question as well.
Immigration's also become a major issue from a foreign policy perspective, a national security issue. And it's one where we see stark differences between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans are very opposed to immigration, not only immigrants coming from Mexico, Latin America, but also Syrian refugees. Immigration has become intricately tied to the issue of terrorism. And on the Republican side, we hear this narrative about immigrants being terrorists, Syrian refugees being terrorists, and ISIS actively trying to plot to include terrorists among the Syrian refugees. On the Democratic side, we hear a different narrative. We hear one where we should try and establish a system in the United States where the immigration process is improved, where there's a path to legalization, and also that there is not really a threat of ISIS terrorists infiltrating refugees who are emerging from the Syrian civil war. So immigration is a really interesting issue because it's both a domestic policy issue and a national security foreign policy issue.
And Kevin, do voters care about this when candidates make statements about immigration? Does it mobilize certain groups? Does it seem to affect people's potential voting patterns?
Yeah, certainly we've seen part of the rise of Trump in the Republican primaries as a function of his pretty vocal stance on immigration. One of the best predictors of whether somebody's going to support Trump or not in terms of a Republican voter is how much they care about immigration, which is a proxy really for what kind of immigration policy they want. It's been less important on the Democratic side, so it's sort of asymmetrical in a sense at this point. My sense is once we get to the general election campaign, immigration is going to fade a little bit because general election campaigns are usually fought in terms of economic performance, a referendum on the incumbent administration and the incumbent party. So I think that we're sort of looking at immigration with a particular focus right now, but that's not going to persist as we get closer to November.
All right. Another hot button issue has been gun control. Going back to you for a minute, Jason. Can you tell us about recent developments with regard to gun control and how they played out in election discussions?
Yes, so the same sort of tactics have been going on with regard to gun control. You've got gridlock in Congress, can't get gun control legislation passed, especially in the wake of these awful shootings that have taken place in Oregon, here in California, in San Bernardino, also other places like Connecticut, South Carolina, various places. And so President Obama has been very emotional. As people probably remember, he held a very emotional press conference talking about children who have been killed and how he just can't believe that he can't get any traction for some of the things that he wants to do, including increasing background checks and getting legislation passed banning more assault weapons and things like that. So again, executive action, executive orders have been the way he's been able to try to deal with that issue. So he's expanded background checks. He has increased funding, U.S. federal funding for research on gun control in terms of the data. How can we access data? Back to the terrorism issue with the San Bernardino shootings, people are still wondering, why did we not know that these committed ISIS followers were plotting this and had these weapons that they had. There's all these stories about how they acquired the weapons, but that's all part of the gun control debate. So Obama's been trying to do something about it, but that will certainly lead to legal challenges in the Second Amendment. And the interesting thing is, when you look at Republicans and Democrats on this issue, there's really no movement on the Republican side with regard to any additional measures for gun control. And they actually have some legal backing for that, because the last two cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court on the Second Amendment have been very friendly to individual ownership of weapons. So it'll be interesting to see. That's an issue that the public, I think, cares about. It's not necessarily my area of expertise. It seems like something the public would care about. Kevin would know more than I. But that could get ugly. Yeah.
Well, and I'd like to, that perhaps could tie back to this question about ideological polarization. It certainly seems that the American public is deeply divided ideologically, and to some people it appears that the ideological polarization in America today is much worse than it was in the past. Is that borne out by the data that you see?
Yeah, it's true both at the elite level when we look at, for instance, members of Congress, but it's also true with the public. The public's been a little late to the polarization party, but they're there. And when we talk about polarization, we're really talking about two things that are occurring simultaneously, the first of which is the increasing homogeneity of the political parties. Democrats are very similar to other Democrats in terms of both the issues they care about and the preferred policy solutions to the problems that face the country. The second thing really is the distance across the parties. So if we were to look at the typical Democrat and the typical Republican, we would see that they're actually quite far apart in what they want government to do. Now, this isn't uncommon in American history. Polarization defines the American political system in many ways, but it used to be the case historically that polarization, this sort of gap between the parties, would occur on a single issue. So we go back, slavery being the most important, questions about the gold standard, ultimately the federal regulation of the national economy, these sorts of issues. What's happened since the 1960s and 70s really has been the piling on of conflict. So rather than having one issue where Democrats and Republicans are polarized but they cooperate on everything else, we now see with the emergence of racial and social, cultural, moral issues, we start to see economic divisions piling on top of differences of opinion about civil rights, about abortion, about same-sex marriage. And so we have this really volatile kind of situation. And sort of one other interesting part of this, actually, if you sort of track how Democrats feel about Republicans and how Republicans feel about Democrats, one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years is that the partisans are increasingly hostile towards each other. They dislike each other, they distrust each other, and they actually think that people on the other side are dangerous to the country. Not just that they disagree with them politically or on substantive matters, but that they're actually a danger to the country. So we have seen a lot of polarization, and that's been accelerating rather than decelerating over the last 10 years.
Now, one place it doesn't seem to me that we've seen quite as much polarization is on many of our major foreign policy issues that we've been facing. And there are a number of these issues, and I'm wondering, Charlie, if you can comment on the various points of view with regard to a few of them. Perhaps we can start with ISIS. Are there any significant differences in how the two major parties are proposing to handle ISIS?
Well, with respect to ISIS and the civil war in Syria, I think the major difference between the parties is rhetorical rather than policy difference. We see on the Republican side, especially since the terrorist attacks in Paris, a renewed sort of vigor and more aggressive rhetorical tone about dealing with international terrorism. And even some discussion of sending large-scale ground troops to Syria as part of an international coalition to address the challenge of ISIS. On the Democratic side, we see a more subdued tone, even a reluctance to say the word radical Islam on the Democratic side. This is something that you won't hear President Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders even saying those words. So it's a more subdued tone, a tone that reflects the idea that this is a long-running challenge, but one that can be addressed not only militarily, but with other types of policy solutions, and one that the United States shouldn't address on its own, but as part of an international coalition. So really, with respect to ISIS and the civil war in Syria, I don't see a lot of policy difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Both want to address the problem, both want to degrade and reduce the strength and ultimately destroy ISIS. So the policy is basically the same. But the rhetoric is quite different on both sides.
So this might be one of those few areas in which you see some sort of agreement.
I think there's agreement on policy, but of course the two parties wouldn't agree that there's
admit it.
The two parties wouldn't agree that there's agreement. But when you actually look at what they're proposing, they're basically saying the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about North Korea? Is the same true with regard to the question of how to deal with North Korea?
Well, North Korea is an interesting case, and I think the same is true here. North Korea recently tested what they said was a hydrogen nuclear bomb. And interestingly, we haven't seen a lot of uproar from either of the parties about how to address this problem. Now, if we can compare that to the situation in Iran, where even the idea of Iran being able to develop a rudimentary nuclear weapon within 2 or 3 years is considered absolutely abhorrent by the Republicans and the Democrats. We have North Korea, another quote-unquote rogue state, testing nuclear devices. But in fact, neither of the parties and the candidates on either side have proposed any kind of strict or obvious policy change with respect to North Korea. So we might again hear some rhetorical difference here, maybe a little bit more bluster, references to using the American military on the Republican side, on the Democratic side, an effort to probably work with a coalition to try and reduce North Korea's influence in the region, but not a lot of policy distinction here either.
Do we see any more differences when it comes to Russia or Putin or Russia's more aggressive foreign policy?
I think with respect to Russia right now is trying to assert itself as an international player. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Russia entered a period of decline. Right, it went from being a superpower to being a country that was really not even a regional player. Now, Vladimir Putin is trying to reassert Russia's position on the international stage. He's done this in a number of areas. He annexed Crimea recently, and this is a big deal in international relations, actually taking territory that's part of another country. And in fact, there have been sanctions on Russia, but that's it.
Pretty much got away with it.
Yes, exactly. And the other major foreign policy move that Russia's made recently is overt entrance into the Syrian civil war and propping up the Assad regime in Syria. Again, we don't see, I don't think, a lot of divergence between the parties on how to address Vladimir Putin. Mostly it's a rhetorical distinction. Some of the Republicans say they'd be more tougher on Putin. They'd negotiate more vigorously with him, but that's not really a policy difference. Every president, whoever is president, is going to be tough, try to be tough on Putin. With respect to tangible policy choices to deal with Russia, we don't see a lot of variance. I'd say the two issues where you do see a lot of distinction in the between Republicans and Democrats are on foreign policy towards Iran and on climate change. Here, two major foreign policy issues which we see a lot of variance. With respect to Iran, the Democrats, Barack Obama just recently was involved in a multilateral agreement with Iran in which Iran gave up some of its nuclear weapons technology and promised to stop doing any research that could potentially lead to nuclear weapons capability in exchange for lifting of sanctions. It's important to note that this agreement was a multilateral agreement between the permanent 5 security countries on the United Nations, Germany, and Iran. It wasn't just a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran, which is something we hear often in the media, but it was a multilateral agreement between Iran and these countries. And it's been hailed internationally and domestically by the Democrats as a big success, that it will ultimately prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons technology for at least 15 or 20 years. On the Republican side, we hear a completely different narrative. This is, they say this is a horrible deal. This is a deal that will ultimately result in the destruction of Israel, in Iran becoming the dominant power in the Middle East, and almost every Republican candidate has promised to do away with the deal on their first day in office. This agreement is not a treaty, it's an executive agreement. So if a Republican is elected, they would have that option. That is, they could remove the United States from the agreement when they took power.
Kevin, does the voting public seem to care about these foreign policy issues?
No, they don't. Especially not in the context of a general election campaign, as we mentioned earlier. When you look at the role that policy plays in a general election, it's actually quite secondary to other more fundamental kinds of concerns like one's partisanship and the performance of the national economy. Part of that is a function of the fact that Americans pay relatively little attention to politics. In order to cast a vote on the basis of something like a candidate's proposed policy towards Syria or climate change or Iran, a member of the public would have to have an opinion on that themselves. They would have to identify correctly the various candidates' proposed policies. They would have to see a difference between the two candidates in order to use that as a sort of way of deciding for who to vote for, and then they would have to vote accordingly. And very few voters can overcome those various hurdles. Far easier, in fact, is to say I'm a Democrat. Typically the Democrats look out for people like me. I'm going to vote for the Democratic candidate. Or to just evaluate the sort of performance economically of the country on the whole and reward or punish the party that you see as being in power. So these considerations are important to some segment of the population. Primary voters are one of those segments. They're certainly consequential with respect to our day-to-day lives, but if we think about them as election issues, they actually turn out to be less important than some other things, like I said, partisanship and the performance of the national economy.
Great. Well, we will explore the issue of climate change as well as many other issues after we take a short break.
There's a world of opportunity available through the College of Continuing and Professional Education at Cal State Long Beach. Do you like to plan large weddings and conferences? You can turn your skills into a lucrative career by taking the Meetings and Event Planning Certificate Program. Maximize your potential in a field requiring professional knowledge and experience when planning the perfect event. For more information, contact the College of Continuing and Professional Education at Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to In Conversation. I am here today with Charles Mahoney, Jason Whitehead, and Kevin Wallsten, professors in the Department of Political Science at Cal State Long Beach, talking about the major domestic and foreign policy issues that are affecting the American public today. So we ended our last segment talking a little bit about foreign policy and what might influence voters. And Kevin, you said that there isn't a whole lot of evidence to indicate that foreign policy issues such as those just described by Charles make a big difference in voting decisions. And I just wanted to start by giving Charles an opportunity to respond to that.
I think Kevin is right for the most part. Most Americans don't have a very clear idea of the minutia of foreign policy, what's going on, what are the major issues of the day, what these intricate points of the Iran agreement, of Putin's foreign policy. This isn't something that's on the mind of most American voters. I'd say that it is more influential in the primary elections than it is in the general election. Recently in the Republican primary, after the Paris terrorist attacks, the fortunes of some candidates have changed based on the perception of how strong they are on foreign policy. Specifically, Dr. Ben Carson's numbers have gone way down since the terrorist attacks, and Donald Trump's numbers have gone up a little bit based on the perception that they're strong, tough on foreign policy, or weak and don't really know a lot about foreign policy. So in the primary elections, I think it can have a significant effect. In the general elections, I'd agree for the most part with Kevin. The one exception would be the potential of a major foreign policy event. For example, this is often referred to as an October surprise. For example, a major terrorist attack on American soil a major terrorist attack on American interests abroad, or even a Paris-style attack on a Western country somewhere. We could also imagine the potential of another North Korean nuclear test or some kind of conflict in that region, stirring up public sentiment in the general election, and perhaps something to do with the Iranian nuclear program. If the agreement between the P5+1 nations and Iran breaks down, Iran begins enriching nuclear fuel again and moving on the direction towards a nuclear weapon, we could potentially see that affect the general election. Besides those big issues, on the smaller points, I think the intricacies of these smaller foreign policy issues, I think Kevin is correct.
How about climate change? You mentioned that before the break as being one area where, within kind of the foreign policy realm, where we do see stark differences between the two major parties. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, on the issue of climate change, there's a vast chasm between the Republicans and the Democrats. Perhaps on no other issue that I've ever seen is there such a huge difference. Most of the Republicans deny that climate change is even happening. Those that even admit that climate change is real say there isn't anything we can do about it, so we're not going to adjust our policies at all. The United States alone can't deal with climate change. The rest of the world isn't doing anything, so why should we change emission standards or things like that? On the Democratic side, we hear the absolute alternate narrative. Most of the Democrats say that climate change is the most important foreign policy issue facing the United States today. In fact, it is an existential threat to the United States and the world. Bernie Sanders has been saying this recently, and Hillary Clinton has been talking about climate change frequently on the campaign trail. So we have this vast divergence between the two parties. One party says climate change is the most pressing foreign policy threat facing the United States, more so even than international terrorism, Iran, or Russia. On the other side, we have a party that says, this doesn't exist. This is imaginary, it's a fabrication, and we're not going to do anything about it. So we have a huge, huge divergence in policy here between the two parties. Now, it will be interesting to see how that will play out in the general election. It seemed to play out in the primaries, right? The sides have both parties have taken sides, distinct points, and hammered away on the issues. In the general election, it might be that the population's opinions are already fixed, and it might not play a big role in the general election.
So I'd like you, Kevin, to comment a little bit more on what actually does motivate voters, what causes them to make the choices that they do.
Yeah, so Charlie's right, there are these sort of vast gulfs on climate change, but as I said before, policy issues are relatively unimportant. They're highly sort of predictive of how somebody's going to vote, which is to say, if you're somebody who doesn't believe climate change is real, you're likely going to vote for a Republican candidate. But that sort of relationship between your policy preferences and your voting arises mostly as a function of the fact that people tend to take their cues from their own party's leaders. So on an issue like climate change, most Republicans believe in the mass public that it's not happening because that's what they've heard from trusted political leaders. When we think about what is actually driving the vote in presidential elections, the general election in particular, it's really the economy stupid, which is an old phrase from the Clinton era, but it remains true. It's also a little too non-specific because you say, okay, the economy, what economy? And after studying this pretty extensively, we've learned that actually people's pocketbook considerations, their own personal finances, don't really predict their vote. People tend to vote on the basis of how the national economy is doing. And interestingly, people don't tend to evaluate a president's performance in managing the national economy over an entire 4-year term. They have a kind of very short-term memory. So the best predictor of who's going to win or lose a general election campaign is really how the economy is growing during the 14th and 15th quarters of a president's term. So that's just really the 6 months or so right before the presidential election. Now, if you were to just know that single piece of information and use that to bet on presidential elections, which you shouldn't do, but if you were to do that, you would be right 80% of the time on the basis of that one statistic. Now, there's a little bit of a change in this, and it relates to partisan polarization, as we were talking about earlier. Because the parties are so clearly sorted and divided, and because partisanship matters so much, there's kind of a firewall to how much the economy can actually matter. Most Democrats view the economy as going fantastically right now. They say, oh, Barack Obama has done such a great job. We're on the brink of a horrible depression. He has single-handedly saved us. We should trust Democrats to handle the economy always. If you were to ask a Republican, they would say, this is, what is this growth that we see? Everyone's unemployed. The only jobs that are available are these part-time jobs at the liquor store or whatever. So you do view economic performance through a partisan lens. So that's a little bit of a change we've seen as a result of partisan polarization, but still the single best sort of predictor of how somebody's going to do in an election is, what party do they represent and what does the economy look like?
But we hear many of the candidates, especially on the Republican side, talking a lot about some of these social issues that Jason was discussing and related to the court. So I'm wondering, Jason, do these issues really matter, or how do they matter?
I mean, it seems to me like what Charles was saying about the primaries versus general election applies just as well to the social issues. You're looking to mobilize a small core of very active, very energized, especially Christian conservative voters with issues like same-sex marriage or religious objections, religious freedom issues, Obamacare, especially the religious objections to contraception in Obamacare. Gun control is a little different though, right? Because it's not just, this is not just a Christian conservative issue. This is an issue where a lot of people, it's more of a regional split. I think you see an urban-rural split, and you also see red state, blue state split in general. But again, will that really predict, how people will vote in the general election? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it will. But I do think that it mobilizes people, and it makes, on the margins, it seems like it does make people more or less likely to vote in a close election. Maybe turnout could be affected. Maybe the get out the vote effort could be affected. On immigration, that's an interesting one, because Republicans have been trying to pick off Latinos from the Democratic Party. This is, I think, part of the reason why Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were at the forefront and have been at the forefront of the primary races on the Republican side. Whether they're going to be successful at doing that in the general election, whether that will even matter, as Kevin says, if the economy is doing well in those last 2 quarters, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the anger seems to be there still. If that happens, if a Democrat wins, because the economy is doing better, there's still going to be there's going to be even more Republican anger, because they're going to point to these issues and say, look at all the stuff the Democrats have done wrong. Same thing on the other side. So, yeah, it's just this long-term divide between the country that tends to be growing.
Another factor that we really haven't gotten into yet is the role of money in politics. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about what factors have contributed to the importance of money in the American political context, and how money relates to election outcomes, voter choices, etc.
Yeah, the role of money in our election system is a real hot button issue. People care very deeply about it. It's really an issue that's evolving quickly, and we're not quite sure how some of the recent Supreme Court decisions that allow for more and different kinds of money in our sort of campaign cycle are actually going to play out, what sort of consequences they're going to have. One reason for optimism about the role of money in campaigns, at least at the presidential level, is that it's fairly hard to find evidence that things like television advertisements matter all that much in persuading people. As I said, all the evidence, all the studies that we've done find that people actually change their opinions very infrequently Partisanship tends to serve as an anchor, and really this country is a 30-30-40 country. 30% votes for Democrats, 30% votes for Republicans, and 40% don't vote at all. So, the role of money has to be sort of considered within that context. Republicans aren't going to be persuaded to vote for a Democrat because they saw an ad. With that in mind, though, there are reasons for concern, I think, which are, politicians believe that money matters, therefore money matters. And there's a real concern that if your opponent is advertising a lot, you also need to advertise a lot, which means you have to please donors. And there's been a couple of studies that have found that actually on the whole, members of Congress are far more responsive to people who make more than $100,000 a year than they are to people who make less. And partly that's a function of the fact that those people are disproportionately represented in terms of making campaign contributions. When you layer that finding on top of the fact that there's now the possibility for having dark money, 501c4 organizations that don't have to report how much money they got from particular sources or who those sources are, there's the appearance at least of impropriety, and that can be very damaging to a democratic political system.
And isn't this one of the reasons why that 40% exists, right? A lot of people will say, I don't want to get involved in the system, it's rigged, rich are the only people that are cared about in politics. So if somebody could come along and exploit that, it seems like they could get a lot of those voters mobilized, maybe.
Yeah,
or not.
Well,
Just depends on.
People participate in politics because mostly somebody asks them to. Mm-hmm. And one way of thinking about the role of money in politics is more money is actually better, because one of the main limitations that campaigns have is that they can't afford to hire enough people to knock on enough doors or make enough phone calls to actually encourage people to participate. So what you get instead, and this is what the Obama campaign was so revolutionary in doing, is highly targeted kinds of mobilization efforts. But that's a function of having limited resources. So one way of thinking about the role of money in politics is actually more of it could be better. If campaigns were using that to make direct contact with voters, encourage them to vote, maybe you would have higher levels of participation, not lower.
So that leads us to another issue that we haven't discussed, which is race. Can you comment, Kevin, a little bit on how the Black Lives Matter movement or candidate statements about race or race relations might drive election outcomes or voter turnout?
Yeah, I think it's easy to be a prisoner of the moment in many ways. And if we take a lot of the rhetoric that's coming from the Republican primary about immigration and about Latinos, if we take the Black Lives Matter protest movements, certainly these create a potential for mobilizing African Americans and Latinos, getting them to show up. Unfortunately, I think restrictions on immigration and police brutality against African Americans, that's not a new issue. We're in the state of California. All we have to do is go back to the early 90s, the Rodney King beating, the riots that were associated with that, Prop 187, highly restrictive immigration policy. We've seen this before. And the question is, did those events actually lead to higher levels of participation for Latinos and African Americans? And the answer is no. If we were to look historically, going back to 1988, Latino participation in midterm congressional elections has never exceeded 40%. Basically, participation in presidential elections has remained low there too, and the same story is true with African Americans. Now, you will see attempts to mobilize African American and Latinos around these issues. Whether they will actually encourage a new set of people to show up and vote on election day, I'm skeptical, because again, these are not new problems. These are problems that have been, sadly persistent features of American political life over the last 30 years, and they haven't increased turnout in the way we might expect if they were really mobilizing issues.
And Jason, are there any issues related to race kind of percolating in the courts right now?
Yeah. Not so much with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's a little too new. The Supreme Court is such a, part of the problem of talking about the Supreme Court in election cycles, the Supreme Court is such a deliberative, slow, ponderous body that it's going to be a couple years before some of those cases percolate up. But there is an affirmative action case on the court's docket, and there was some the internet was abuzz a few months ago because of some of the exchanges in the oral arguments on that case where Justice Scalia, a favorite of social conservatives for a long time on the Supreme Court, Scalia questioned, using one of the briefs that had been filed in the case, questioned whether or not it might be a mismatch if African Americans and other minorities are put into elite or helped into elite universities with affirmative action, and there was a huge furor about that. And it just, to Kevin's point, it just completely blew over, and no one seems to be talking about it in terms of a general election. Would you put another Scalia on the court? Mr. Trump, Mr. Cruz, that's not, at least so far, been an issue at all. But there certainly is potential for affirmative action, which with Prop 187 and other state-level restrictions on affirmative action all around the country, and higher education and other public institutions trying to find ways to take race into account. It's on the Supreme Court's docket right now with the University of Texas. And if they make a decision saying affirmative action is unconstitutional, does that become a voting issue? I don't know. It certainly will make the news, but it's there to be exploited.
And Charles, we already talked a little bit about some potential events that could or could not occur with regard to international affairs that might affect the election outcome or election debates. Could you kind of lay out for us a few potential scenarios with regard to foreign policy that you think might be possibilities over the course of the next few months?
Sure. Well, we hope this doesn't happen, but some kind of large-scale terrorist attack that occurs either in the United States against the United States interest abroad or in another country, I think could play a distinct role both in the primary process and in the general election. We have to remember that we've only really had one major terrorist attack in the United States, and that's 9/11, and that drastically changed the political discourse in this country, the way people view national security, and increased levels of fear and trepidation amongst the population. We've had a number of small-scale terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11, most recently the shootings in San Bernardino by individuals who claimed support for ISIS. They weren't members of ISIS, but they claimed to be inspired by ISIS. Now, I don't think another small-scale attack would generally alter the race dramatically, but a large-scale attack could have a distinct effect on the way people vote. It could potentially increase turnout. It could change perceptions of the candidates. The candidate who is viewed as being able to keep America safe might be more likely to win a few more votes, a few more percentage points, and that can make all the difference in an election. Remember, just a couple of percentage points in a general election is the difference between winning and losing. So I think that's one scenario that could occur. We've seen terrorist attacks have big impacts on elections in other countries, most notably Spain after the Atocha bombings in 2004. Fortunately, that hasn't happened in the United States. But I do believe that the potential exists. And then there's also the scary thought that terrorist organizations, knowing that an election is coming up, would try and plan an attack around that time to alter the outcome of the election. So those are scary thoughts. We all hope they don't happen, but potentially. Besides that potential event happening, we also have the Iran agreement, a potential nuclear another test or action by North Korea in some way, destabilizing Southeast Asia, and potentially the other wild card is Putin. We never really know what he's going to do. But I'd say the most likely scenario that a foreign policy event influences the election is some kind of large-scale terrorist attack.
Jason, how about in the courts? Is anything, do you see kind of coming up in the courts?
Yeah, it's interesting because, as I said, Supreme Court rarely affects electoral politics. It's more of a slow-moving process. But there is a potential scenario under which I think it might make a difference. So you've got a Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is in her early 80s, who's had some health issues. There's been a lot of discussion by Democrats, in fact, some Democrats urging her in public, in editorials and various blogs, to retire because of the uncertainty about what's going to happen in the general election. So let's say that she heeds that advice and decides to retire. This is sort of the most well, maybe right now you could get it. You could at least have a nomination that could sort of fully make its way through the Senate. But I mean, the Republicans in the Senate are certainly not in election year going to allow Democrats to appoint another Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the court. So this is going to be a fight either way, right? You're going to have either Republicans blocking a Democratic effort, or you're going to have Ginsburg perhaps waiting because of that fear, not wanting to make herself the election issue or her seat the election issue. She could wait. You could have a Republican president looming on the horizon, and if you have a very close election, I could well imagine NARAL and a whole host of NOW and a whole host of other feminist groups saying Roe versus Wade is up for grabs. I mean, there are 7 cases on abortion before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. If they begin deciding those cases in a conservative direction, and you've got this looming retirement that could change the outcome of a Roe versus Wade, if that precedent is up for grabs next term, that could be a huge issue. And it's not often that sort of stuff, that sort of drama at the Supreme Court could have any effect on an election cycle. But imagine also that there's an illness or something like that. So anyway, a Supreme Court vacancy or a looming vacancy, I don't know, that's a potential scenario that could make a difference.
And Kevin, you've talked a bit about what factors drive voters' choices when they decide to vote. But what about what factors drive voter turnout, and how important will voter turnout be in this election?
Voter turnout's always very important, and voter turnout in presidential elections is always much higher and much more representative of the American public than turnout in midterm congressional elections. One thing I think we can expect to see is the increasing sophistication of turnout efforts. That's partly a function of the increased money that we were talking about, but also partly a function of the fact that the campaigns are getting very skilled at using data analytics for figuring out both what groups of voters they need to target and how to target them. Again, the Obama campaign has been very successful at sort of drilling down to the micro level and figuring out what a person like you might be really interested in terms of mobilizing you to get to the polls. What we see, though, is that basically the Democrats and the Republicans are kind of equally skilled at doing this. So oftentimes they're canceling each other out. So there's not a strong advantage for one side or the other, but both sides are going to do it. There's going to be a lot of attention paid to making sure that people show up to vote, and the ways in which the political parties are going to attempt to contact you is going to evolve. Expect to see a lot more communication occurring through text message and through social media sites like Facebook and Twitter. Wherever you are, they will find you, I promise.
So if voter turnout really can determine who wins and loses, I wonder if each of you could comment on what's at stake, for the viewers. Why should they vote? What's at stake with regard to foreign policy, domestic policy? How can the election outcome really result in policy differences? So maybe start with you, Charles.
Well, for foreign policy, it can be a difference between war and peace. I mean, if we think about the 2000 election in which George W. Bush narrowly defeated Al Gore, I don't think that there would have necessarily been a war in Iraq if Al Gore had been president. There certainly would have been some type of action in Afghanistan after 9/11, but a war in Iraq definitely wouldn't have happened, and that would have changed the course of history in the Middle East and in the United States. So I think people need to think very carefully about who they are going to elect and potentially what the president's perspective on using military force is, because who you elect can be the difference between going to war or not going to war, and that can change the entire course of American and world history. So it's a huge decision, and the stakes are very high in foreign policy.
Jason?
Yeah, and I think with regard to especially social issues on the domestic side, if you get a president a Republican president, for example, who is socially conservative, you've already got this huge block of socially conservative legislators who are just itching to do all kinds of things, like defunding Planned Parenthood. That was a huge fight that happened in the last year, given all of those behind-the-scenes sort of secret videos that were released purporting to show the selling of body parts by Planned Parenthood. So that is something I think that a socially conservative Republican president would probably do. The same thing on with regard to the issue of abortion, not so much in terms of legislation or executive orders, but again, that all-important Supreme Court seat that could shift the balance on the Supreme Court, that could make a huge difference. I think with regard to the religious objection issue to Obamacare and things like that, those are going to work their way through the courts regardless of which party is in power, I think. I don't think it's really going to make a huge difference on that, but it will certainly embolden. If you get a socially conservative president, it will embolden Christian conservatives to bring more of these challenges and to feel like they're like this is really a religious freedom issue that is gaining more traction. And so that could make a huge difference going forward from here. Whether you'll get that, even if a Republican wins, is questionable. Because I think no one knows, for example, whether Donald Trump is really a social conservative or not. National Review, has, and other conservative voices have urged Republicans not to vote for him. So that's an open question. But I think the stakes are pretty high if it does go in a conservative direction or a liberal direction. You could get the opposite results.
Great, Kevin. One last brief.
Very briefly, gridlock. If you like it, split your ticket in voting. If you don't, vote the party line.
All right, we'll leave you with that. Thank you for joining us today for In Conversation, and I hope that you will take into consideration all of the issues that we've discussed today when you get out there and cast your vote.